He walked into a company he owned, but the reception he received felt nothing like victory. The doors of Vega and Voss swung open, and as the new owner, James Thompson, stepped inside, the staff didn't see power. They saw a threat. In his simple hoodie and jeans, he looked nothing like the millionaire behind the brand they had admired from afar. And as his footsteps echoed through the luxurious showroom, the employees' sneers and whispered doubts filled the space. They had no idea who he was. The showroom of Vega and Voss was a carefully curated display of opulence. Gleaming glass cases showcasing diamonds, gold, and platinum pieces that whispered wealth with every shimmer. The walls were adorned with tasteful art, the lighting soft and warm, casting an inviting glow on the carefully arranged jewelry. But the atmosphere in the room shifted the moment he entered. The staff, clad in sharp suits and immaculate uniforms, took notice of his casual appearance, a slight shift in their body language telling the story before any words were spoken. He walked past the polished counters and glistening treasures, his presence unnoticed at first. But the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the very space around him was filled with the question no one dared ask out loud. What is he doing here? His eyes were steady, scanning the room with the quiet assurance that came from knowing exactly what he had earned and where he stood. He wasn't here for approval. He wasn't here for validation. He was simply here to take his place, to assert his rightful ownership of the empire that he had helped build. As he moved deeper into the showroom, a figure at the front desk caught his attention. Susan. She was mid-conversation with another employee, but as she noticed him, her tone faltered. Her eyes narrowed just enough to signal her skepticism, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. She had no idea who he was. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her voice polite but tinged with doubt. Her gaze took in his hoodie, his sneakers, and the casual air about him, a look that only added to her suspicion. "Are you looking for something specific?" He met her eyes without hesitation, his calm expression unshaken by the judgment in her gaze. "Just looking around," he said casually, his voice even, as if he were a regular customer. Susan's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. She was sizing him up, and it was clear she had already decided what he was. An outsider. Someone who didn't belong in this exclusive space. Her body language was stiff, her patience already running thin as she subtly began to assess if he was even worth the time. "Are you shopping for a piece today?" Susan asked, her words coming out with a hint of condescension. "This is Vega and Voss after all. We cater to a very specific clientele. Our pieces start in the six-figure range." The words hung in the air, loaded with judgment. But he didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He knew this company better than anyone in the room. "I think I might be," he replied smoothly, nodding slightly at the display case in front of him. "But I've been involved in Vega and Voss for a long time. In fact, I've designed a few of the pieces you have here." The statement wasn't an exaggeration. It was a simple truth that had yet to be revealed. But Susan's response was immediate. A skeptical raise of the eyebrow, followed by a glance toward her colleagues who had begun to notice the exchange. She didn't believe him, not for a second. James Thompson's journey to Vega and Voss hadn't been a simple one. He didn't just wake up one day with the ambition to own a luxury jewelry brand. It started years ago, in the backrooms of small design studios, sketching ideas for jewelry pieces that would one day adorn the world's elite. He was a young man with raw talent and an unshakable drive to create. Despite the challenges of being a black designer in a predominantly white industry, he never let obstacles stop him. Working in the shadows, James designed for some of the most prestigious jewelry lines, crafting pieces that became the face of luxury. No one knew his name. He didn't care. All that mattered was his work, and the satisfaction of knowing that his designs were being worn by those who could afford the finest. Over time, his work garnered attention, and his wealth grew. He knew it wasn't enough to be behind the scenes forever. James had watched Vega and Voss rise to prominence, a brand built on the very principles of luxury he admired. But the more successful they became, the more he saw how his designs were treated as someone else's achievements. He wasn't content being just the creator. He had earned his place at the top. So James took the plunge. He bought the company. It wasn't a flashy affair. There was no grand announcement, no press conferences, just a simple legal transaction that turned James into the new owner of Vega and Voss. It was a quiet acquisition, handled behind closed doors, out of sight from the public eye. For the first time, James felt a true sense of ownership, but he knew this would be the test, the moment where he would prove that he wasn't just a designer, but the person behind the empire. Instead of walking in with a display of wealth, he chose to dress simply, blending into the background, an unassuming presence among the polished and perfectly manicured world of Vega and Voss. This wasn't about showing off. This was about asserting ownership and letting the brand feel his presence when the time was right. The showroom felt different now. James entered Vega and Voss with no fanfare, no entourage, just himself. His sneakers softly tapped against the marble floor, his hoodie a stark contrast to the gleaming walls of jewelry. He was met with a collection of disinterested glances, none of the staff recognizing who he was. To them, he was just another customer, a nobody in casual clothes who didn't belong in a place like this. The employees continued their work, their conversations muffled in the background as James made his way through the showroom. He passed by glass cases filled with diamonds, gold, and platinum, pieces of art that bore his fingerprints. It was an odd feeling to see his creations in the hands of others, knowing that no one here knew the truth. They didn't know that these designs were his, that this brand's success was a direct result of his vision. James stopped in front of one of the display cases, pretending to study the jewels inside. He could feel the stares now, the curious glances of the staff, who were beginning to notice the stranger in their midst. Their skepticism was palpable, their discomfort hanging thick in the air. They didn't know who he was, but they would soon find out. As James continued through the showroom, the murmurs among the employees grew louder. They exchanged quick glances, their eyes filled with doubt. His presence, unremarkable in his casual attire, didn't fit their preconceived idea of what the owner of Vega and Voss should look like. The dismissive glances, though veiled behind forced smiles, were sharp and quick, like quiet judgments being passed with every step he took. It didn't take long before one of the managers, Susan, approached him. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she sized him up, her heels clicking firmly against the marble as she made her way toward him. She had no idea who he was, of course, and her demeanor suggested she already felt the need to question him. "You look like you're here to shop," she said, her tone polite but laced with an underlying edge. "But this is Vega and Voss. You know, we have a very specific clientele. The pieces here aren't for everyone." Her words hung in the air, each syllable laced with subtle judgment. She wasn't saying it outright, but the message was clear. He didn't belong in a place like this. James caught the edge in her voice. It wasn't just about what he wore or where he stood. It was something more, something deeper. She was questioning his worth. And the mere fact that he was there, uninvited and unrecognizable, was enough to make her uncomfortable. James stood still, not showing a flicker of irritation or discomfort. His calmness was unshakable, and he knew better than to respond with anger or confrontation. This wasn't the time to show emotion or react to the subtle hostility that had been building. Instead, he let Susan's words sink in, observing the way she spoke to him and how she looked at him with such subtle disdain. "Just looking around," he replied, his voice steady and even, with no hint of aggression. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't flustered. If anything, he was simply surveying the room as any owner would, taking in the space, the people, and how they carried themselves. Susan didn't quite know what to make of him. She had expected someone more refined, more fitting of Vega and Voss's elite brand. Instead, she was met with a man who exuded a quiet confidence that made her feel uncertain. His response was simple, but it was enough to throw her off her calculated approach. She took a step back, her eyes briefly scanning his face before turning away, her thoughts clearly unsettled by the calmness in his demeanor. James knew what she was thinking, but he didn't need to prove anything. Not yet. He continued to walk through the showroom, allowing his presence to linger in the air like a quiet challenge. The employees, watching him with growing curiosity, had no idea who he truly was. But soon they would. As the morning wore on, the whispers among the employees continued. It was clear that James wasn't what they expected, but he remained composed. He didn't feel the need to shout his authority. Instead, he let his actions speak louder than words. As he moved from one section of the showroom to another, he paused by a few pieces that caught his eye, pieces he had designed, pieces that had helped shape the success of Vega and Voss. At one display, James casually reached out and adjusted the placement of a diamond-encrusted bracelet, his fingers brushing over the delicate setting with familiarity. He was calm, yet the way he moved with the jewelry, like someone who had worked with it every day, was undeniable. Susan, who had been watching him from behind the counter, couldn't help but notice the way his hands moved so confidently, almost intimately, with the pieces. She took a step forward, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "Is there something that catches your eye?" she asked, her tone still polite but now with a hint of uncertainty. James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I've designed this one," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of truth. "The clasp, the curvature. It's all part of the vision I had for Vega and Voss." Susan's breath caught for a moment. The statement wasn't a boast, just a matter-of-fact truth. But it was enough to make her pause. She hadn't expected this. In fact, she hadn't expected him to say anything at all. For a brief second, she seemed lost in thought, as if she was trying to reconcile his words with the reality she had built in her mind. The seed of doubt planted in Susan's mind quickly grew, and within minutes, others began to notice the stranger with such intimate knowledge of the brand's most prized creations. The air in the showroom seemed to grow heavier, the tension palpable. It wasn't long before a more direct confrontation occurred. "Excuse me," another employee said, walking up to James with a look of skepticism. "You've been here for a while now, but we still don't know exactly who you are. You've mentioned designing pieces, but you're telling us you own this company? That doesn't make any sense." The question was blunt, and it cut through the air with a sharpness that left no room for ambiguity. The skepticism in his voice, though masked by politeness, was clear. They didn't believe him. They couldn't. James turned slowly to face him, his eyes cold but focused. He didn't flinch at the accusation. Instead, he stood there, his stature unyielding. "Do I need to show you the paperwork?" James asked calmly. His words were direct, his voice steady. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was simply asserting the truth. The employee, whose name James didn't yet know, glanced back at Susan and the others. It was obvious they were all questioning his legitimacy. The subtle racism and disbelief in their eyes were becoming more evident with each passing moment. "What are you really doing here?" Susan asked, her voice low now, almost incredulous. She didn't want to believe him. She couldn't. James gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. He didn't feel the need to explain further. Instead, he simply nodded toward the office door in the back. "If you want to verify my identity," he said, his voice calm and unwavering, "you can ask the legal team. The ownership paperwork is in my office." The tension in the room grew thick, the staff now fully aware that something was off. But instead of escalating the situation with anger or frustration, James let his presence linger, quiet and powerful. He knew the truth would come to light, but for now, he let them stew in their disbelief. James could feel the eyes on him, still skeptical, still unsure. The staff had never seen someone like him walk through their doors, let alone claim ownership of Vega and Voss. But the more they doubted him, the more he leaned into his quiet authority. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about showing them the depth of his connection to the brand. His expertise in this world, the history of Vega and Voss, and his intimate knowledge of every piece of jewelry in the showroom would prove he wasn't some random visitor. He was the mastermind behind the brand's success. He walked towards another display, his fingers grazing a necklace with a complex, intricate design. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the weight of the piece sink in. "This one," he said, as Susan and another employee watched from the counter, "was designed for the Royal Gala last year. The emerald in the center, It's cut in a way that enhances the stone's natural brilliance. It's something Vega and Voss has become known for. Custom-cut gems, refined over decades. There was a pause as the words settled in. The employee who had questioned him earlier took a few steps forward, now visibly confused. "You designed this?" James nodded once, his calmness never wavering. "Yes, it's part of my legacy with this company." The murmurs among the staff grew louder, but James didn't look at them. He knew that his knowledge, his fingerprints on every piece, was the ultimate argument. They had no idea who they were talking to, but soon they would. The whispers of disbelief spread like wildfire throughout the showroom. James had made his point, but he knew the real test was yet to come. He needed them to understand not just who he was, but that he now held the reins of this company. Without saying a word to anyone, James turned toward the manager's office, the door heavy with expectation. He knew the staff was watching, waiting for him to make a move. He hadn't come here to argue. He had come to show them that the power dynamic had shifted. Inside the office, he sat down behind the sleek desk, taking a moment to adjust the chair. The room was filled with framed images of jewelry designs, his designs, yet they had never acknowledged him. The irony was not lost on him. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to the legal department. "It's time to initiate the restructuring," he said plainly, his tone calm, collected, authoritative. "I want a full audit of the design teams, and we're starting the hiring process for new leadership in key positions. The company culture is going to change." As he hung up, he glanced out the office window toward the showroom. The staff below were still on edge, still trying to make sense of the man who had just walked in and claimed ownership of their beloved Vega and Voss. James stood up, walked to the door, and as he opened it, he made eye contact with Susan. Her expression was still one of disbelief, but it was beginning to crack, just slightly. "Changes are coming," James said, his voice steady but firm. "And it starts today." The quiet hum of the showroom was replaced by an underlying tension, as the staff realized the gravity of what had just occurred. Whispers filled the space as James's words echoed in their minds. "Changes are coming." The employees exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. There was no immediate rebellion, no loud objections, just the slow realization that the man who had been dismissed as an outsider was now in control of their future. James's calm assertion of power had shaken them, and with each passing minute, the uncertainty in the room grew. Some of the staff had already begun to question their previous assumptions, but they were too proud to show it. Others simply refused to accept the new reality, still struggling to reconcile the idea of a black man, someone they had never considered to be part of their elite world, owning the company. A few employees gathered in hushed circles, their murmurs mixing with the ambient sounds of the showroom. It was clear. The balance of power was shifting, and no one quite knew how to handle it. There was a sense of unease, the weight of James's presence settling heavily on their shoulders. As they tried to regain their composure, one employee, a younger man, nervously approached Susan. "What are we supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Susan didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the events, her thoughts swirling with the truth she couldn't deny. She had been one of the most vocal skeptics, dismissing James as a fraud, but now the weight of her own assumptions hung heavily around her. "I don't know," she finally murmured, her voice barely audible, the uncertainty settling deep in her bones. "But we'll have to find out soon enough." As the days passed, the air in the showroom grew thicker. The whispers had turned into muttered remarks, some subtle, others less so. A few employees began to openly challenge James, their skepticism morphing into something more overt. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was a slow, simmering resentment that made itself known in passive-aggressive remarks, deliberate avoidance, and stares too long for comfort. One afternoon, as James examined a new line of pieces in the showroom, a senior employee, Greg, approached him with a forced smile. "I don't know how you managed to get your hands on this place," Greg said, his tone heavy with implication. "But you have to know that people like us don't just come in here and start running things. It takes years, decades to earn a seat at this table." James raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady and unbothered. He had learned long ago not to rise to bait like that. But Greg's words were a clear reflection of the underlying racial prejudice that now started to manifest in full force. "I've been part of this company for years," Greg continued, taking a step closer. "But you, someone like you can't possibly understand the weight of what Vega and Voss represents." James didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, their harshness cutting through the otherwise quiet showroom. Instead of engaging in a verbal sparring match, he simply looked Greg in the eye, his expression unwavering. The silence spoke louder than any words could. Greg, sensing his own words had failed to move James, looked away, his grip tightening on his clipboard. James, however, remained composed, unshaken by the thinly veiled hostility that had become more and more common in the past few days. The confrontation between James and the staff had reached a boiling point. It was no longer just about jewelry designs or ownership. It had become a battle for respect and acknowledgement. His presence, the calm authority that he had carried so effortlessly, now felt like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about the company. The tipping point came when the senior staff called a formal meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as employees filed in, reluctant and anxious. They had been forced into this meeting by the undeniable truth that their assumptions about James's legitimacy were beginning to erode. James walked in last, his expression calm but firm. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood at the head of the table, letting the silence settle as the staff took their seats. He could feel their eyes on him, the skeptical glances that had followed him from the moment he walked through the door. But he didn't flinch. He wasn't here to beg for their respect. He was here to claim it. "Let's get straight to the point," James said, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken weight. "I am the owner of Vega and Voss. It's time you all understood that." The room was silent, the staff looking at each other with disbelief. Some had been quiet, hoping the tension would pass. Others had been waiting for this moment to see if James was going to back down. But this was no time for indecision. "I've been more than just a designer here," James continued. "I built this brand, from the ground up, with my work and my vision. You've seen the pieces, you've admired the designs. They came from me. But now I own this place, and it's time you all respected that." The employees exchanged uneasy glances. Some seemed uncomfortable, others still in denial. But the message was clear and it was sinking in. James had not only built the company, but he had also acquired it. And now he was in charge. James knew that words alone wouldn't change everything. He had come to Vega and Voss not to prove his worth to anyone but to claim what was rightfully his. The ownership papers, the legal documentation, the stock certificates, they were all in his hands now, and he wasn't going to hide behind them. He was going to lay them out right in front of everyone. He walked over to the long conference table and placed a stack of neatly organized documents in front of the senior staff. The top sheet was a title deed to the company, official and undeniable. Beneath it, stock certificates, signed transfer papers, and the legal agreements he had signed when purchasing the company. "You're welcome to review the documents," James said calmly, gesturing to the papers. "But there is no mistake. I am the owner, and if you want to continue working here, you'll need to accept that fact." He didn't need to say more. The documents spoke for themselves. The employees gathered around the table, their hands shaking slightly as they began to look over the papers. The reality of the situation began to settle in, piece by piece. It wasn't just the truth of ownership that was weighing on them now. It was the truth that they had underestimated him, had failed to recognize him for what he was. And now they had to confront the consequences of their actions. The silence that followed James's declaration of ownership felt heavier than anything that had come before. The room was still, frozen, as the senior staff members processed the reality of what James had just said. Their eyes flicked between the legal documents on the table and the man standing before them, an embodiment of everything they had dismissed. The disbelief was palpable, like a cloud that had settled over the room, suffocating any remaining arguments. Some employees stared at the documents as if they might suddenly disappear or be proven false. But there was no escape from the truth. The legal papers were clear. The ownership transfer was official, and there was no mistaking it. James Thompson was the owner of Vega and Voss. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the air conditioning, once a distant sound, now seemed deafening in its stillness. James stood at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but commanding, waiting for the staff to gather their thoughts, waiting for them to accept what they had refused to believe up until now. Finally, it was Susan who broke the silence. Her voice, usually sharp and authoritative, now faltered slightly as she addressed James. This can't be right, she said, though the conviction in her words had waned. You! James cut her off with a simple gesture, his calm demeanor undisturbed. It's right, he said. His voice even, no trace of arrogance, just undeniable fact. I've built this company with my work. Now I own it. And if you want to continue working here, you'll need to respect that. The staff exchanged glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. The tension that had filled the room was now replaced with a quiet unease. Some faces were flushed with shame, others with disbelief, but one thing was certain. They could no longer deny who James was. Once the meeting was over, James retreated to his office. The weight of the moment still lingered, but the silence in the room hadn't shaken him. He had known this was coming, and while part of him had hoped the staff would accept him more easily, he couldn't be surprised by their resistance. This was what he had expected, the fight for respect, the struggle against the assumptions based on his appearance, his race, and his background. James sat in the chair behind his desk, looking out at the showroom through the large windows. He could see the staff milling about, still exchanging whispers, still unsure of how to approach the new reality. He didn't have to guess what they were thinking. They were trying to reconcile the man they saw before them with the story they had told themselves about who was worthy of running a company like Vega and Voss. He exhaled deeply, reflecting on how far he had come. He had worked his whole life to be here, to prove that talent, vision, and hard work mattered more than race or appearance. But it had never been easy. The constant pushback, the silent biases, the doubts. It was all part of the journey. And now, as he watched the employees below, James knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't here to just claim a title. He was here to change the culture, to break down the walls that had been built around this company for so long. The battle for respect wasn't over, but he was ready for it. He had to be. The tension in the building didn't dissipate immediately, but James knew that the power dynamics were shifting. He could feel it in the way the staff's attitude toward him had changed, if only slightly. The whispers were still there, but now there was a hint of uncertainty beneath them. It was no longer a question of who he was. It was a question of how long they could ignore the fact that he was the one holding the reins. He moved through the showroom again the next day, his presence felt more acutely now. He walked with purpose, observing the employees more closely, noticing how they interacted with each other and with the customers. Their nervousness was visible, their efforts to maintain professionalism strained by the knowledge that their world was changing. And James was the catalyst. But instead of taking pleasure in their discomfort, he began to make subtle changes that signaled his control. He spoke with Alex, the regional manager, about revising the sales tactics to be more inclusive, more welcoming to diverse customers. He made it clear that he would be implementing new policies for hiring, and that no one, regardless of their background, would be overlooked or dismissed again. James knew that changing the culture of Vega and Voss wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But he was willing to do the work. He had already started to rebuild the company from the inside out, starting with its values. The shift in power was unmistakable now. It was no longer a matter of who was in charge. It was a matter of who would make this company better. And James Thompson, the black designer who had once been dismissed, was now the man leading that change. James could feel the weight of the struggle settling in. The shift in power was undeniable, but it wasn't without its challenges. The employees, though now fully aware of his ownership, were still struggling to accept the change. There were no outward rebellions, no open protests, but it was clear that resistance was simmering beneath the surface. The subtle racism and elitism that had long been a part of the company's culture hadn't disappeared overnight. Some employees, like Susan, began to adjust. Her coldness toward him had softened slightly, but it was still there. A lingering discomfort that made her interactions with James awkward and forced. She would smile, but it didn't reach her eyes, and she still couldn't fully shake the disbelief that someone like him, a black man, could be in charge of a company she had always believed was for the elite, for people like her. Others, though, resisted the change more openly. Greg, the senior employee who had questioned James's legitimacy earlier, was the most vocal in his dissatisfaction. James noticed the subtle sabotage, half-hearted efforts at ignoring his input, rolling eyes behind his back, and the quiet mutterings that carried just far enough for James to catch them. But James wasn't deterred. He knew the battle for respect was a long one. He had faced worse throughout his career, countless moments where his talent had been overlooked simply because of the color of his skin. This was just another obstacle, and he would face it head-on. The real work, however, was in changing the company's culture. Not just in earning the staff's respect, but in teaching them how to respect each other, regardless of appearance, background, or rank. The moment for a public display of James's ownership came sooner than he expected. A high-profile jewelry launch was scheduled in just a few weeks, one of Vega and Voss's biggest events of the year. The grand affair was meant to celebrate the unveiling of a new collection, a line James had personally designed. The timing was perfect. It would be his moment to show the staff, the clients, and the public that he was the true face of Vega and Voss. This wasn't just a jewelry launch, it was a statement. As the event began, James stood at the center of the showroom, a vision of calm authority. The glint of diamonds and platinum surrounded him, but his presence commanded the room more than any piece of jewelry could. The staff, who had been avoiding him, now watched from a distance as he interacted with high-profile clients and business partners, his demeanor gracious but firm. He spoke with confidence, yet with a humility that made those around him take notice. Susan, who had been organizing the event, couldn't ignore the way James carried himself. It wasn't just his wealth or the success of Vega and Voss that commanded attention. It was his quiet confidence, his ability to navigate this world with grace and authority, no matter the judgment others passed on him. As the evening unfolded, it became increasingly clear that James Thompson was not just the owner of Vega and Voss. He was the soul of the company, and no one would be able to overlook him anymore. His authority, once questioned, was now unquestionable. Not everyone was ready to accept the change that James was bringing to Vega and Voss. While most of the employees were slowly coming to terms with his ownership, there were still pockets of resistance. Greg, in particular, was becoming more vocal in his discontent. It started with subtle sabotage, ignoring James's input during meetings, taking longer than necessary to carry out his requests, and offering backhanded compliments about how things used to be better before James's arrival. These actions were small, but they were deliberate, part of an ongoing attempt to undermine James's leadership. The racial prejudice that had been simmering beneath the surface was now showing itself more clearly. Some employees had begun to question whether a black man could truly lead Vega and Voss, a company that had always been associated with old money and established prestige. The microaggressions were becoming more frequent, the uncomfortable stares more pronounced. James was aware of it all, but he didn't respond with anger. Instead, he doubled down on his resolve. The more they pushed, the more he would prove them wrong. He began implementing bold changes, hiring new, diverse talent for leadership positions, making it clear that Vega and Voss would not be a company that tolerated elitism or exclusion. The employees were starting to realize that James wasn't going to back down. He had built this company, and now he would make it stronger, more inclusive, and more powerful than ever before. But for some, that vision of change was too much to accept. The pushback was inevitable, but it would only make James's victory even sweeter. Despite the pushback, James Thompson remained calm, resolute in his vision for Vega and Voss. The subtle sabotage, the overt resistance, it only fueled his determination. He had faced worse in his career. This was just another chapter in a long history of proving people wrong. And James had always been good at that, at turning doubts into motivation. He spent hours in meetings talking to the legal team, the HR department, and his key leadership staff. His goals were clear: revamp the hiring process to ensure more diversity in senior positions, introduce new company policies focused on inclusivity and respect, and revitalize the brand with designs that reflected the diverse clientele he wanted to attract. James knew that these changes wouldn't happen overnight, but he was in it for the long haul. One afternoon, in a quiet meeting with Alex, the regional manager, James made it clear that he would not tolerate any further attempts to undermine his leadership. "If there's resistance to the changes we're making, we need to deal with it," James said, his voice firm yet measured. "I won't let anyone sabotage this company's future because of their personal biases." Alex nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll make sure to keep things in check, James. The staff's starting to see it, but it's going to take time." "I'm patient," James replied, his tone calm but unwavering. "But I won't be passive. We're going to make this company reflect what I've always known it could be. A true leader in luxury that isn't just for the elite, but for everyone." The cracks in the staff's resistance began to show sooner than James had anticipated. Susan, who had once been the most vocal in her skepticism, was the first to approach him with a shift in her attitude. She had been wrestling with the reality of the situation, questioning the assumptions she had clung to for so long. One morning, after a particularly difficult meeting where tensions had run high, Susan made her way to James's office. She stood outside the door for a moment, unsure, but then knocked gently. When James looked up, she hesitated before speaking. "James, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "Come in," he replied, his gaze steady but welcoming. Susan stepped inside, standing near the doorway, her posture awkward. She had always been proud of her position, confident in her authority, but now, she wasn't so sure. "I owe you an apology," she began, her words heavy with sincerity. "For the way I've treated you, for the doubts I had. I didn't want to understand, but I do now. I see the changes you're bringing, and I know you're right." James listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it from her made the journey feel more real. "You've been pushing for something I wasn't ready to accept," Susan continued. "But I realize now that I was wrong. I see what you're doing, and I'll do my best to support it. To support you." James nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Susan," he said, his voice calm but grateful. "This company will be stronger because of this, because we're all learning and growing together." James had begun to see tangible results from the changes he had implemented. The new hires, the diverse leadership team, and the revised policies were all starting to reshape the company. The staff, though still adjusting, was beginning to come around. The old barriers of elitism and exclusion were being slowly chipped away. James had been keeping a close eye on the staff, making sure that his vision for Vega and Voss was being executed with integrity. And though there was still work to be done, the signs were clear. The company was starting to thrive under his leadership. One morning, he walked into the showroom to find employees engaging with customers in ways he had never seen before. There was a new energy in the room, a warmth, a sense of inclusivity that hadn't been there when he first walked through the door. The luxury jewelry brand was no longer just a symbol of wealth and exclusivity. It was becoming a brand that valued people, all people, regardless of their background. James's eyes scanned the room, noticing the small changes, how the staff now greeted customers with genuine interest, how they took the time to explain the designs and their significance. He could see the difference in the way they interacted with him as well. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a quiet respect that hadn't existed before. He smiled to himself, feeling a sense of quiet pride. The work wasn't finished, but Vega and Voss was on the path to becoming the company he had always known it could be. The culture was shifting, the walls of prejudice were crumbling, and James was at the heart of it all. He had not just taken control of a company, he had reshaped its future. Months had passed since James Thompson took control of Vega and Voss. The changes were no longer just on paper, they were alive in the atmosphere of the company. The elitism that had once seeped into every corner of the showroom had begun to dissipate. There was still work to be done, but the company had transformed in ways James hadn't expected. The employees, once skeptical and distant, now respected him, not because of his title, but because they had seen his vision take shape. Those who had doubted him, those who had questioned his ability to lead, now recognized that he had been right all along. The shift in the company's culture was not just about inclusivity. It was about the idea that true luxury didn't belong to just one group of people, it could be something for everyone. Under James's leadership, Vega and Voss was flourishing. Sales were up, but more importantly, the reputation of the brand had shifted. The world now saw it as not just a symbol of opulence, but of progress. It was a company that valued talent, diversity, and innovation over exclusivity and tradition. James knew that he had won. Not just the battle for ownership, but the battle for respect, for his rightful place in a world that had once excluded him. Walking through the showroom one afternoon, James watched the staff interact with customers in a way that felt natural and genuine. There were no more whispers or sideways glances. The tension that had once marked every step he took within the company had vanished. It wasn't just the success of the company that made James smile. It was knowing that he had reshaped the culture, broken down the barriers, and built something more than just a jewelry empire. He had created a legacy that would last far beyond the glittering pieces on display. James stood in front of the Vega and Voss building, looking up at the gleaming glass structure that had once felt like an impenetrable fortress. It had taken years of hard work, dedication, and determination, but he had finally made it. He had bought the company, asserted his ownership, and now stood at the helm of a business that was no longer just a brand. It was a symbol of his journey, his resilience, and his ability to push through every obstacle that had been placed in his path. The sun was setting behind him, casting a golden glow on the building, a perfect reflection of everything he had worked for. He thought about the early days, the struggles, the doubts, the moments when he had wondered if he would ever be given the chance to prove his worth. But here he was, standing on top of it all. Behind him, the staff had gathered for a company-wide meeting. They had learned from him, and he had learned from them. It wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about leadership and respect. They had all grown together, and now the company was poised to continue thriving, not just because of the wealth it generated, but because it had become something more, something greater. James turned and walked back into the building, a quiet sense of pride in his chest. He wasn't walking into a company he had to prove himself in anymore. He was walking into the future he had built. This was his legacy. For more chilling true time crime stories, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like and share.